Now I have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers, Michelle De Leon, Hannah Robbins, and Amalia Harrington, who will be talking about the ways that storytelling can strengthen collaborations across disciplines and cultures. And this reminds me, I've been in this building just down the hall with a bunch of students who were talking with Senator Mitchell. And this was one of the things he wanted to talk with the students about. One of the points he made was that about the emotional power of Abraham Lincoln's stories and the way that that helped inspire our nation during a particularly tumultuous time in our history. So a lot of different people think that storytelling is an important part of creating this future that we think we can contribute to. So a little bit more about the speakers, and then I'll let them tell their own stories. Michelle De Leon is a master's student in ecology and environmental sciences and a participant in the National Science Foundation's research traineeship on enhancing conservation science. Hannah Robbins is the communications manager with Maine Sea Grant, and Amalia Harrington is a marine extension associate with Maine Sea Grant. Again, the title of their talk, Storytelling, a Tool to Inform Collaborations. Take it away.
Thank you, David, for that great introduction. It was really great to hear about Senator Mitchell's priority and recognition of the power of storytelling to affect change. Before we dive into our talk today, I'm going to read a land acknowledgement. I recognize that the University of Maine is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. Since time immemorial, the Scudic River watershed has been the heart of the Passamaquoddy ancestral homeland. The Passamaquoddy recognize that the ecosystem and related natural communities have an inalienable and fundamental right to flourish and evolve, and also that the relationship to the river is sacred. The Passamaquoddy have a unique cultural and historical relationship with the river ecosystem and the fishery, which have allowed the tribe to survive. The tribe continues to preserve, protect, restore, and enhance all tribal lands, waters, air, and human health. The Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. So today, our talk is focused on storytelling, a tool to inform collaborations. I'm joined today with Hannah Robbins and Amalia Harrington at Maine Sea Grant. And we're so excited to be here today. And we've been thinking about this talk for a while now, thinking about storytelling, what is storytelling? And to be honest, it was kind of challenging to think of something that is all around us, that we do every day, but to stick that pin in it and be able to share this with you all today. And what was so challenging to think about storytelling is that there are so many ways that us as humans use storytelling to connect, to learn, to listen, and even to act. And so we had a lot of head scratching thinking about, well, we know storytelling is useful for research, for communications. We know storytelling is really helpful for working across cultures and especially working across academic disciplines. And so when we thought a little further on this, we started to think about, okay, what do we really know about storytelling? Well, for one, we know that storytelling is not new to scientists. In fact, a manuscript in an academic journal, in a sense, is a story being told to the academic community from a group of scientists. Also, scientists often seek to communicate their research to non-academic audiences, and this can go through an op-ed and other non-academic outlets. And so that's a more traditional approach to storytelling. We also know that storytelling can be collaborative. And so maybe we can take more non-traditional approaches to storytelling. And we can think about how storytelling may be able to engage people who have not traditionally participated in science. And maybe that looks like storytelling being a community project. And so when we put our heads together, we thought about this traditional approach of scientists sharing the stories of their research, but also this non-traditional approach of using storytelling as a way, as an approach to science to engage others into our projects. And so in our talk today, we're going to have a couple key takeaways that are going to help you challenge how you think about storytelling. And hopefully you'll be able to rethink storytelling and adapt it to your own work. And this is important because when we're thinking about our traditional uses of storytelling, we're also thinking about collaboration. And collaboration is at the heart of sustainability for how we can learn together from and with each other, how we can work across boundaries. And this is so important for not only the sustainability, but also for the Mitchell Center. So here, I'll share two takeaways. One, collaboration deepens storytelling. And so when we take our different perspectives and we learn from each other, we listen, and we share skills and knowledge, we may be able, especially as scientists, to share a story that is deeper than what it could have been if, say, only a scientist from one discipline had shared it. And as we were thinking about this complexity around storytelling as something that's all around us, but then also hard to pin down, we also thought about how storytelling in a circular way can also deepen collaboration. And so when storytelling is a project where we're working across disciplines, across cultures, across boundaries, again, we get to learn from each other. And so today in the talk, we're going to focus on two examples of one of which is how collaboration deepens storytelling. And Hannah and Amalia at Sea Grant will be sharing their work on that. And then I'll be able to share some of my research about how storytelling deepens collaboration. And we'll do all that before we go to the Q&A. But before we dive into those two examples, let's take a step back and think about what is storytelling. Storytelling has so many definitions, like many other concepts that we face when it comes to sustainability. Kruger et al. Has a well-accepted definition of narrative, and narrative is storytelling. In this definition, they say a representation of connected events and characters that has an identifiable structure, is bounded in space and time, and contains implicit or explicit messages about the topic being addressed. So what can we pick out of this? We can see that there are certain elements that create a story. So maybe from when you're a kid, or if you enjoy novels now, you'll think, oh, this book, a story, it has a plot, it has characters, there's a climax, and I'm engaging in this text through this setting. But here today, I want you to rethink what a story is. And maybe there are some elements of that story, like characters, like a plot, or even the setting of having these place-based sustainability issues. And so take a broader definition of storytelling today, and that will be my challenge to you. Think about storytelling as an engaging way to share information. And then also, as we walk through these two examples in depth, I challenge you to also think about how can you learn from different elements of our examples and maybe apply it to your work. Again, storytelling can be collaborative and it can work across disciplines and cultures and other boundaries. And so that'll be my challenge to you all today, to rethink what storytelling is as a tool for collaboration. And with that, I'm going to hand the screen over to Hannah and Amalia so they can share their work about how collaboration deepens storytelling.
All right, well, thank you, Michelle. That was a wonderful introduction to set us up for today. And so we will be diving into the first example, the first theme that she mentioned, which is collaboration deepens storytelling. So my name is Amalia Harrington. I'm a Marine Extension Associate with Maine Sea Grant, but I'm also the Regional Lobster Extension Coordinator for the Sea Grant American Lobster Initiative. And so my work really as a Sea Grant member, as well as part of this program, is to really try and focus on increasing the American lobster industry's resilience to the impacts of ecosystem change across the Northeast.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Robbins. I'm the communications manager for Maine Sea Grant. I work with Amalia, and I write stories for our website. I work with the press, and I think a lot about communication strategy, both for Maine Sea Grant, but also for individual products and projects. And one of my favorite things to do is to work with scientists to help them make their research accessible to non-scientific audiences.
So today, Hannah and I are going to be talking about how we put together an interactive story that explains how rising ocean temperatures are impacting all of the different life history stages of the American lobster.
And we're doing this in part because, and I think I can speak for Amalia, I think she'd agree that the product that we came up with in the end is a much more robust product and a much better story than what either of us could do on our own. Our collaboration with each other and with others really played a key part in developing the final story.
So to provide some context, so I came to Maine Sea Grant in March 2020 as a lobster ecologist by training. So I have a really strong background in research. And I had recently finished up a postdoc position looking at how ocean acidification and warming impact lobsters. So as I was wrapping up that work, I was diving into the literature and was really excited about a number of recent publications that have come out looking at how warming oceans change where lobsters are being found and what habitat they're using. So when I started with Maine Sea Grant and this regional extension program, I shared some of these publications with our team, and two of the other researchers, Dr. Carolina Bastidas from MIT Sea Grant and Jenny Rubin from Woods Hole Sea Grant, were also really excited by these projects and really wanted to try and share this work with the wider community. So we had this list of publications that we wanted to try and synthesize into a more easily digestible product, because the Sea Grant community includes not just researchers, right? We have a really broad range of stakeholders that might be interested in hearing more about the science. So we compiled our references and organized things by themes. And we came up with what we thought was a really great outline that we drew up into a 2-page outreach product. And this is our initial sketch that Jenny put together. So we were really, really excited by this product, but since we're all scientists, we wanted to reach out to someone who has expertise in communication. So this was our first collaboration where the researchers got in touch with our communication specialist, Hannah, to get some input on the product that we were thinking of putting together.
Yeah, so Amalia shared her idea with me, and like her, I was also very excited. In particular, Amalia brought to the table something that I wouldn't normally have access to. I usually read like a single scientific paper that a researcher will send to me for a story, but I don't regularly read all the scientific journals that are out there in the world. And Amalia had pulled together research articles from multiple journals scattered across the scientific universe. And she was seeing an opportunity to kind of collate and share that information into one cohesive story. So I was really excited about that. I was very jazzed. But I did have a few questions. And the first of which was, who are you reaching out to? Who's your audience? It's almost always the first question that I ask at the start of a project. And that's because I make a lot of my decisions based on who that audience is. I think about what background or context they might need, what messages might resonate with them, how they access information, and what kinds of products they are likely to engage with. So understanding who the audience is matters. For example, working with Amalia, I've learned that lobsters have a really complex life cycle full of multiple larval stages and habitat changes. And I was concerned that if she put together a white paper or a literature review for the general public, the reader might not know what typical behavior or development looks like at each stage of the life cycle, and therefore they might not be ready to consume information about how rising ocean temperatures are changing that behavior or development.
So needless to say, after meeting with Hannah and having her share her expertise with us, Jenny and Carolina and I realized that the 2-page sketch that we came up with was probably not the best fit for what we wanted to do.
And to be fair, it might have been a really excellent format for another audience or another project. It could have resonated with other scientists or legislators, but probably not the general public. So we talked about what formats might work or what tools might work, and Amalia, Jenny, and Carolina decided to move forward with a story map. So for those that aren't familiar, ArcGIS Story Maps is a storytelling tool that pulls together texts, images, maps, and other multimedia content. And you can use what's available and published in different places on the web, or you can generate your own. And here you can see examples from our published story. Amalia and her co-authors created and drew on many different types of media. And as a communicator, I really like story maps because it gives the reader different options for interacting with the story. It can be really engaging, but it can also be tough and time consuming to get original new material without help from other people.
So after Hannah shared some example story maps with us, the wheels really started turning. But since we settled on this format, like Hannah just mentioned, we really needed to generate a lot more content than we had initially planned with a 2-page sort of handout product. So we had our text, but we really needed to figure out what images and videos would really make this story map exciting and interactive for people using the page. So we ended up reaching out to a lot of other researchers for input. And just one example I'd like to share is that we reached out to Dr. Kisei Tanaka from NOAA Fisheries, pictured up here on the slide. He was one of the lead authors on one of the projects that we were really excited about, one of the papers that we wanted to share. So we reached out to him and he was willing to share his raw data with us so we could generate our own maps, which is exactly what Jenny did. So this is just, again, one example, but we also found some really great distribution data for lobsters on the Rutgers Ocean Adapt page. So we created our own maps and our own video. And we also pulled some resources from the NOAA Voices project, particularly those that Natalie Springle from Maine Sea Grant contributed to the project as part of her Voices on the Maine Fishermen's Forum. So we ended up with a lot of really great content and a lot of material to put into our story map. But again, we really needed some input from Hannah in terms of like, what do we keep and what do we take out? So we turned it back to her for some help.
Yeah, and I actually really appreciated being involved at that part of the process, because when I looked at it and I read it, it read a little bit like a textbook at first. So we went back to the drawing board. I offered some ideas for editing, but I also suggested that we reach out to other Sea Grant communicators in the region to get their input. their perspectives, and to collect information about how they interact with the multimedia platform. It was a really useful collaboration. Some of the collaborators and the communicators were more comfortable with technology and some were less comfortable. They pointed out that not everyone would intuitively know when to scroll or where to click or how to get videos to go back to the beginning after watching them, or even how a slider might work, which was not something that had crossed my mind at all when we first thought about using story maps as a platform. And because the communicators work in other states, they were able to offer a perspective that was unique to the communities that they work with. They helped us think about ways to frame the story or to like jump into the story that would make it interesting and useful for the entire region, not just people in Maine. And finally, we had other Maine Sea Grant communication staff check the content for accessibility. They checked the images for alt text, and they did a test read on a screen reader. Again, making sure that we were making the story available to the broadest audience possible.
So we had a lot of input and a lot of collaborative discussions with this big group of people, and it really helped us refine our story. So we were able to kind of go back and adjust the ingredients to make sure, like Hannah said, we had a robust product that was useful for the broadest audience as possible.
So in preparing for this talk, Amalia and I thought, how do we really explain kind of the depth of the impact that these collaborations had on developing a final story?
And Hannah came up with this really great analogy, and we started to think about this process as cooking a stew. So our story map is the stew, and all of these different content items like the text, the maps, the images, videos, those were all like the raw vegetables and the broth going into our stew. And the collaborating researchers were sort of like other chefs that brought in new ingredients to add to the flavor.
And the communicators helped develop the broth by like seasoning the soup and editing the recipe. Everybody had something to contribute, and altogether we made like a much yummier product that more people could enjoy.
So from all of that information and all of those conversations, we ended up with this really fantastic story map product called A Fishery in a Sea of Change. So we'll put the link to the page in the chat. It's also on the slide here. But we don't have time to go through all of the really great content. So I'd urge you to all take a look if you have some time after today. But I just want to share that once we launched the page in April of this year, and to date, we've had over 1,300 page views. And while most of these users are from the US, we've had some visitors from around the globe, including places like Ireland, the Netherlands, the UK, Australia, and Thailand. And we've had a number of repeat users as well, which is really exciting. And people are investing a lot of time, upwards of 6 minutes, really diving into this page and engaging with the content. And we also received overwhelming support from industry members like the Maine and Massachusetts Lobstermen's Associations. They shared the link to our story map in their e-newsletters and with their industry partners. And we also received really positive feedback from researchers, both affiliated with the American Lobster Initiative, but also in the wider lobster community, as well as state and federal management agencies, as well as the Maine delegation. So it looks like this product that we worked together really hard on was able to capture the interest of a variety of end users, which was fantastic and what we really wanted to do with our end product.
Yeah, so what have we learned from this experience? Clearly, collaboration deepened our storytelling. The scientists with other scientists, scientists with communicators, and communicators with communicators. When trying to reach a broad audience, taking a broader perspective and collaborating works. We learned to beta test our stories and to listen to perspectives from people who we were trying to reach. And we also learned that using mixed media made for a more compelling product. I would encourage everyone to look at the story map and check out the interactive life cycle diagram that Amalia made. You can scroll through it. And as you scroll through, it moves from like life stage to life stage to life stage. They're like these like little lobster substations, and at each station you can see a photo of what the lobster would look like and then learn more about the specific impact at that stage in their life. It's very, very cool. I did want to put the caveat that like I in no way want to imply that multimedia is always better. It just depends on your goals for your storytelling project. But in this case, it was really effective. And we also learned that slow and steady wins the race. So it took us probably, we think about 9 months from conception to publication. And for me, that was a little less surprising, but I think it might have been a little bit longer than other people on the project were expecting. And I'd argue it was really time well spent. And it was necessary for effectively collaborating. We wanted to make sure that we weren't just like checking off boxes as we were bringing people into the project. And I do want to say, like, I feel really fortunate to have a colleague who was flexible and who valued input from others and who allowed time and space for those collaborations, because it took a really long time.
So with that, we just want to quickly acknowledge all of the various partners and people that provided input and collaborated with us to really make this wonderful story map product, including all of the Maine Sea Grant folks, the MIT Sea Grant researchers and communications team, also those from Woods Hole. And we also had someone from Connecticut give us a Southern New England perspective, which was really great. And with that, since we're right up at our time, Michelle, I will turn it back to you to talk about how storytelling deepens the collaborations.
Great, thank you. And Hannah was mentioning to you all, go check out the story map. It looks really great. It does. And so I just wanted to put that plug in there as well. So Hannah and Amalia shared their experiences of how collaboration isn't easy, and they had to go through multiple iterations. It took 9 months, but that there's this project, this output that was so useful for them, for others in the region, and it had a lot of positive feedback. One thing that when I was learning about Amalia and her work, and especially with the story map, she told me that a congressional representative had actually cited the story map on the American lobster in response to a constituent. And so that was really exciting to see how collaboration was able to bring this rich product. And so as they talked about how collaboration deepens storytelling, how can storytelling deepen collaboration? I had mentioned earlier that storytelling is a way that we can, as scientists, we can bring those who have traditionally been marginalized in scientific processes into the conversation. One of those approaches involves Indigenous research methods and storytelling more specifically as an Indigenous research method. What does that mean? In a nutshell, Indigenous research methods center Indigenous sovereignty. They respect different ways of knowing and are also inclusive of diverse perspectives. And so the goal of IRM is to, again, involve other perspectives into the process. But what is the goal of the project that I'm working on? Well, let me tell you about that more. So I participate on Story Maps team, which is led by the Passamaquoddy tribe at Sbayak. This team was initiated after 2019 community meetings in Sbayak, and those meetings were conducted with support from the University of Maine. Wabanaki tribal members were able to identify some of the issues that they see in their community, not only social issues, but also ecological issues, and how those may have some messy interactions. And so as the community members shared their perspectives on what priority issues should be, the environmental department was able to take their feedback and identify some priority narratives. One of those priority narratives is municipal drinking water quality. On the left, you see this bathtub with brown water, and you might think, did someone just shower? Was someone rolling around in the mud, perhaps? When in reality, this is the color of the water when it comes out of the faucet. And so this story is being told by a Wabanaki and Deep Science student who was able to take and share this picture. But as we think about how to share information, we have to think about a platform. So like Amalia and Hannah, the team had moved toward ArcGIS story maps. I know they've worked on it and that story maps are growing in popularity, but using your Zoom reactions, could I get a thumbs up if you have heard of or ever used story maps? And maybe you can have some conversation on the chat on what you've done before. So some people. Well, as Hannah had mentioned, story maps are a multimedia tool where you can have photos, maps, images, text, video, you name it. And it's embedded into a website that's published. And all the content that's published is the intellectual property of the Passamaquoddy tribe. Today, for not only for reasons of time, but also because of intellectual property, I won't be sharing the story maps with you today. However, if you're interested in hearing more about the water quality issue, feel free to send me a message after the call or after the talk today, because we are launching it soon, which is really exciting. So what do we do together? The Story Maps team right now involves a staff member at the environmental department at Sabayak, again, the Wabanaki Youth Science student, someone from or a staff member from Maine Sea Grant, and also myself. Together, we share knowledge about the water issues, also skills on building a story. Hannah had even mentioned that when she was working with the team of Sea Grant Extension specialists, her first question was, who's your audience? And so by sharing our knowledge and skills, we got to craft content in a way that could be digestible for the public. And we also offered support for each other, mainly administrative and technical support. This allowed us to learn about the needs of the community, also the interests, not only professional, but the personal interests, and maybe some tangential projects that can come together. For example, the mentor of the student storyteller has some interest in water justice and is thinking to work more closely with the environmental staff department, or department staff rather. And so there are opportunities to further collaborate. Also get to learn more about the history of water issues, also what knowledge is passed down throughout generations, throughout the culture. And so this is what we focus on the team. We think about how we're going to, what content we're going to put in the story map, but then there's more at play. I alluded to how there's likely going to be this further collaboration. Well, on that, we also get to build trust with one another and deepen our relationship. We're also prioritizing this ethical research approach where we can have equitable partnerships and also value different ways of knowing. And in valuing these different ways of knowing, we're also celebrating diversity. And so when we think of storytelling as a community project, it's more than just saying, this is what my water looks like, but rather it's saying, this is what my water looks like. My community is afraid to drink the water. We want to feel safe, and water is sacred to us. And so what are some ways that storytelling deepens collaboration? Well, one of them is that this is culturally relevant. And to be culturally relevant is significant for collaboration because then you start to pick up on those nuances of how to interact with your colleagues. And again, that's deepening the relationships embedded in the storytelling project. Storytelling also allows respect for Indigenous sovereignty, recognizing the need for Wabanaki voices to be heard throughout our state and throughout our community. And this is important and relates directly to the emerging Indigenous research methods that seek to uplift these often marginalized voices that are often left out of our more traditional scientific processes. So going hand in hand with that, storytelling also seeks to center Wabanaki diplomacy. There are a few researchers here at UMaine that are looking at what it means to center diplomacy. And it's not just a check on the box, but rather it's a process of engagement, a process of action, also one of respect and cultural relevance. And so as we look again at storytelling, how it can deepen collaboration, we can also think about how this is fostering these more ethical partnerships. And when we think of partnerships being based in trust, in equity, and respect, then it starts to make sense how we are able to better collaborate across our boundaries, whether those boundaries are cultural, geographic, disciplinary, or even organizational. When we know we can look to others to tell stories, and we see that there's more opportunities than just having a outreach tool, rather than storytelling just saying, hey, this is the issue. There are also calls to action. And so my hope is that you're able to see that storytelling is a community project that can help open the door to how we collaborate with each other and also on different projects and deepening that relationship. And so as I think more about storytelling, there's also a lot of questions that continue to come up. And like I said at the beginning, I mentioned we are really scratching our heads. We were thinking storytelling's all around us. What exactly do we want to say about it? And part of the reason that was so challenging, again, is because there are so many interesting ways that storytelling is being used. There are the traditional approaches, like an academic manuscript in a journal. But then there are also some traditional approaches with a twist, like how you saw with the American lobster story map. And again, I encourage you to look at it later today. But then there are also these more non-traditional approaches that are outside of how we traditionally look at science, ways that could engage non-scientific communities, such as, in my case, the Wabanaki. And so some questions that come to mind for me are there other voices that are continuing to be marginalized? What does the storytelling process mean for the power and the agency in our relationships? How is storytelling going to affect change and action in these communities? Also, the thought of democratizing science has continued to be strong throughout the past couple decades. And so one question is to think, if we consider democratizing science a way to invite those who have been traditionally marginalized in Western scientific processes, then how does this give power to others? Also, how does storytelling help us learn across disciplines, across different ways of knowing, across different organizations, so we can create more effective, sustainable solutions together. And so those are the questions that we continue to sit with, though I open the floor to everyone else to share your thoughts. And one of the things I want to add before we move into questions is, again, I hope you all have been able to rethink storytelling as not just these traditional elements, but also how we can take a different approach, how you can learn from our examples today and adapt it to your work. Thank you.
Terrific. Can you hear me?
Yes, Linda.
Great. Everyone, I can hear down the hall, people are clapping, but in your own home or your office, wherever you are, can you first, before we do questions and things, give a clap for this just great talk that asks us to think more deeply about key things that we're doing, and also to think about how we might use this information in ways to change what we do in terms of our work. And one of the things that was so exciting across all of the points that all of you made was how much you talked about collaboration, and that it's really about not just the product, but really working across differences. Could be disciplinary differences, could be other kinds of differences. Do you have an example or two of where we might watch this happening so we could learn more about it?
I'll defer to Hannah to share, because I know Hannah's really excited about storytelling, and especially her role as a communications manager.
Great.
So I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. It's where can you see kind of interdisciplinary storytelling happen? I mean, I think all around us, and I think it's an opportunity that everybody has access to. It's about kind of developing your network and kind of like thinking about who you're working with. And I really like the point that Michelle made, which is that it's an opportunity to think about and diversify who our collaborators are. So I think it's, I mean, it's kind of an unsatisfactory answer, but I think it's everywhere. You just have to look for it.
Yeah. Can you give us an example? Maybe this is an unfair question, but can you give us an example of where you really struggled? You couldn't figure out how to have that person that you wanted to collaborate with understand you, and vice versa, how you could understand them, and how you made progress. Do you have any examples like that? Or has everything always worked perfectly for you?
I like to say it always works perfectly. No, that's not accurate. But I think for us, we had kind of alluded to it, but it was with the timing. Like, it took a very long time for us to kind of balance working on this project with all of our other duties that we were doing, and also to kind of like time that with other people in the region that we were working with. And so I think it was just, I don't know that there was necessarily a tension or like a problem with pulling collaborators on board, but it was about making sure we were finding space and time for them, and being really patient so that we could, and maybe readjusting our expectations so that we're prioritizing that collaborative input and getting that input from over kind of like getting a product done or a story done in a really short turnaround time.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Another question is, you talked about ARC, you all talked about ARC GIS story maps. How do we learn more about that? Are there short courses? Are there things that, or do we just follow you around so we can learn, what that is? Help us learn more.
That's a great question. So ArcGIS is a product by Esri, and if you're part of the University of Maine, you do have access to story maps. Luckily, the platform is very intuitive and there are plenty of resources available through Esri, and I believe a training as well. I do want to highlight that story maps is just one tool to use to tell a story. There also are traditional ways to tell a story, like with PowerPoint slides. And so there are different ways if you're seeking multimedia stories. Hannah had mentioned that multimedia is not necessarily the best, but it does really depend on the content and the story that you want to deliver. So if you don't plan on using maps, for example, then story maps may not be the best tool for you. I should also mention that there are some who push back on the use of story maps because of it being a corporate product and having everything be on a cloud. So there are plenty of opportunities. And if you're interested in story maps, I really encourage you to head to storymaps.esri.com and you should be able to find more information there. Hannah?
Yeah, I was also just going to add one of the things that we liked about it, and that was really important to us. In fact, we weren't really sure where it landed on this for a while. We had to do some research, but that Story Maps allows for ADA compliance, and so that particular part was really important to us too.
So, thank you very much. Those are really helpful. So one of the issues people are interested in is how do we go about thinking about our audience, going beyond just a general audience? I think, Michelle, you mentioned the excitement that a congressional person was really interested, but how do you think about as you're going about this, your audience? And do you think about school kids, for example? Are they one of the groups that you're trying to reach as you're thinking about lobsters and their interest in lobsters, for example, or water quality? Sort of help us understand some of the strategies for thinking about an audience as you get involved in this.
So when we first put together the content for our sort of draft 2-pager, that was that really silly cartoon in the slideshow. At first we were thinking we would make something for lobstermen that we could put in the lobstermen's newspaper, so like a printout that people could look at. So I think initially we were trying to target industry members, but Hannah helped us phrase it in a way and take a step back to make it accessible to not just industry members, not just scientists, but also just people in general that might be interested in lobsters. So for this product specifically, since we had that really great platform where we could put a bunch of different content in there, we kind of sprinkled a little bit of basic biology in there. So that way, you know, school kids or the general public might be able to understand sort of the basic biology of lobster and why temperature is important. But then we had links to the journal articles within the story map. So people who were like researchers or scientific members of the community who might want more information at a higher level could then go find those papers directly and get more of a scientific approach to that as well. So I think with story maps, we were able to sort of address a broader community, but Hannah was really instrumental in asking those questions. You know, who you're trying to get is going to dictate if we want to do a 2-pager or something more accessible. So Hannah, I don't know if you want to add to that too.
Yeah, in developing this story too, one of the things we did pretty intentionally and was, I think the idea of our colleague down at the MIT Sea Grant was to think about the story in sections, and so that different sections were relevant for different people as well. And so I believe the story map opens with graphs and data about the economic value of lobster, but it goes by each state. And so that communicators from each individual state could just take that information and then share it with their audience and kind of like tailor it to their local kind of geographically relevant audience, maybe not necessarily like a specific stakeholder type, but like a geographic type. And so we thought about audiences a lot that way as well. And that was a really interesting component to kind of like think about, here's the story as a whole, but what are different ways that we can kind of like break it up and share it with people in really digestible chunks that are really relevant to like different specific audiences too. So we did think about that a lot as we were building it out.
Yeah, and
very
just
interesting.
to echo Hannah, where she mentions to make relevant to different audiences. In our work, we think about what do we know that we want to share, and when we identify an audience, what is it that we want them to know, or even what is it that they may want to know. I had noticed a question in the chat about specifying more than just the general public. And for the story maps team, I can't speak to that directly. I wasn't part of that decision-making process, but the story maps team is led by the Passamaquoddy, and the intent of that story map is to share it with tribal leadership to build more awareness about the water quality issues. It's not a visible it's not a visible issue for everyone across the reservation. My teammates have described to me that due to privileges, whether it's in transportation or location of where they live, they may have better access to water or even be able to afford bottled water more regularly. And so it is a little more specific than just general publics.
So, David, did you want to ask a question, or can I go ahead with some of the others?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay.
Oh, hang on a sec. Looks like we've got a question from Tony Sutton.
Yeah. Oh, thank you all. I just had a question about kind of like the application of storytelling across both of these contexts, because both of you are all working in very different cultures that have traditions in storytelling, and they also have drastically different approaches of how they conceptualize storytelling. So I was just curious if either of you could comment on how those differences in culture shaped how you thought about storytelling in each of these contexts.
That's a great question, Tony. I'll start with that. So Tony had asked, how does our understanding of different cultures shape the storytelling process? And I'm really cognizant of my role on the story maps team. As someone who's not a tribal member on this team, I'm not a storyteller. Rather, I'm supporting the storytelling process by the Wabanaki tribal members. What I'll say is, working across these cultures, I think about and really listen to and reflect on what it is that the storytellers seek to share, and understand why it's important, where they learned it from, and help them take those key messages and put it into their story map. And so again, I'm just supporting the storytelling process, and a lot of listening has gone into working across the cultures. And I think one more thing that was really interesting that Hannah and I had talked about in a planning meeting for this talk is that even how we think about defining an audience may be different across cultures. Like, that's very Western to say, what does the audience want? And whereas that may not be the case in other cultures. And as Tony alluded to, there are different ways to tell stories that are accepted and per different cultural norms.
So, Michelle, I have a question for you. you've had really interesting jobs way out there in North Dakota, in government, doing some important work. How would you use what you're learning about story maps and help people out there learn?
Yeah, that's a great question, Linda. I think story maps are a great way to communicate information to non-technical audiences like Amalia and Hannah talked about today. Story maps are also great for engaging the community, which is more of what my work is akin to as a community project. I think there are a lot of ways that story maps can be integrated. I think one of the challenges to using story maps for communicating information or as a community engagement tool is that there can be some data sharing restrictions or boundaries, especially when it comes to government. And so I think there are plenty of opportunities. When I was in North Dakota and also in New York, I've got to think about storytelling and thinking about who's telling different stories how across different media, primarily text and visual. And so I think that there are different ways to apply it, and that's what I appreciate so much about storytelling. There are different applications for it.
Very interesting. You began this talk saying collaboration deepens storytelling and storytelling deepens collaboration. And that's just such a wonderful way to frame what you were sharing with us and helping us learn. How do we go forward? How do we think about that? Do you have any suggestions for us about what we should do tonight and tomorrow and beyond so that the collaboration is deepening storytelling and storytelling is deepening our collaboration? And you don't have to have an answer, but in case you do.
I mean, I can share what I plan on doing going forward. I think a big component of both of those things is listening. So when you're collaborating, it's about like listening to your collaborators. And when you're storytelling, it's about listening to yourself, or when you're listening, or when you're on the other side of storytelling, listening to the storyteller. And so I know for me, I really value listening to the people around me and what they have to say. And so for me, that's a big component of how I'm going to be working moving forward too. So.
Thanks.
And I'll just echo Hannah. Actually, I was going to say the same thing. Listen, there are stories all around us, and we might be missing some really interesting information, perspectives if we let them pass. And that information and perspectives can actually deepen the work that we do, or even how we approach our own work. So for that next step, Linda, I encourage listening and starting today.
Okay. I think we may be out of time, but I would guess that everybody that has been listening in has a lot to think about over dinner tonight, over breakfast tomorrow, and you might be getting some emails from a lot of people who are interested in continuing this conversation. So thank you.
Great job, everybody. Thanks so much.